okay? Oh yeah, me too, Ray. I'm so excited for this session, actually. It's really nice to welcome you here, Jeff. So thank you so much for joining us today. Just a brief introduction for Jeff here. He is the PhD and the esports director at Ohio University. He works with faculty and administrators to incorporate games and games-related technology into classroom practice. And he frequently delivers talks and keynote addresses on game design, games and learning, and the need for games literacy in educators. When he isn't working, Jeff is playing too much Animal Crossing and trying to get better at Rocket League. Really great intro, Jeff. So thank you so much. Let's give him a warm welcome.
Thanks for having me. This is great, and yeah, good morning to everyone out there. I'm in a somewhat reputable hotel on the East Coast of the United States. Getting home has been an adventure over the past couple of days. So if a brick comes through the window, that'll tell you how the session's going. But I just want to start by saying, thanks to Annika and Rhea for inviting me to be a part of this conference, and then for Kim for helping me moderate this session, and for all of you for showing up and kind of hanging out for a few minutes. And judging by the opening that we just had with Lisa and Stuart, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir in a lot of this. So I feel like we're all on the same wavelength with so many things going here. And so a couple of things I'm going to play a little fast and loose with during my session, because it just seems like everybody's got it, and I think it's just something we can kind of expand upon as a group a little bit. But let me start sharing my screen here. I think I'm on one screen today, and so that may give me a little bit of a challenge, but we'll see what happens here. Let's see if I can keep everybody here. Oh, I'm getting the advanced. Can I share my screen? Do I have that permission? Let me see.
You should, yes.
Yeah, I've made you the co-host, so you should have access to that.
All right, there we go. There I am. Now I'm up and running. Okay, let me do this, and I'll go full screen. I won't be able to see everybody here for a little bit, but let's get into it. Let's talk a little bit about video games, and it's great to be able to talk about video games at a national conference and film festival, and I'm excited to kind of kick things off with this, because I think what I've seen so far with everybody already today is just this idea and this kind of urge to create, and really so much of what we're going to talk about today is based on that. Giving students that opportunity as much as we can. Understanding that my context is different than your teaching context, and where we can find ways to get students to do more and be more active learners, and the ways that video games can help us do that. And part of that is sharing some ideas from myself or from my colleagues, but also it's kind of a request, a pitch for help in that what are the ideas that you have that you can share and bring to the table. Because one of the big challenges with using games in the classroom is a lot of the research out there is about how students are motivated or how students are engaged with games, but not necessarily what teachers are doing. What are the practical steps that I need to go through in my classroom to make them a success? So, if you've got ideas and things that you've done with games in the classroom, please find ways to share it out there, because it's something that we can all benefit from. So really, that's part of the talk too, is just to say, join in the fun. But before we get into kind of the teacherly aspect of it, I want to start with just kind of the big, broad, section of why games. Why are we talking about games, and what are games? There's a lot of fast and loose terminology we're going to use with games today. So, I may talk primarily about video games, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about board games. I'm also going to talk a little bit about classroom activities. And so I'm going to be using the word game or video game kind of interchangeably. But, game developers, they often say, if it's not fun on paper, it's not going to be fun digital. So it's still that spirit of active learning, active engagement, whether it's a video game or a board game or a card game. Really, I don't think matters too much as we get into things a little bit. And so, I want to talk about this in big picture first, and think about, why are we discussing video games now? Video games have been around for, depending on your definition, 50 to 30 years, somewhere in that time frame. But if we look at the video game industry compared to the traditional media industries, for example, the music industry is about a $30 billion a year industry. But video games are 125, some estimates as much as $150 billion a year, but they don't have as much presence in the classroom. And there's that kind of challenge that we're running into of, there are the traditional media literacies that are widely accepted. As an educator, I might use a song in my class. I might use a movie, definitely use a book. But when I use a video game, there can often be this resistance as to why. And so the question we really are trying to figure out is, why is there that resistance? But it's become so big, the industry is so massive that we really have to think about it in terms of, bringing it into the classroom and accepting it as a major media literacy, the same way we do music, movies, television, books, theater. So, thinking about that, and the one example I like to use with this is the directors of Avengers Endgame, Joe and Anthony Russo. Avengers is not an Easter egg, so ask Heidi. I don't think there's an Easter egg in this talk. But after making Avengers Endgame, the biggest movie of all time, they're now making trailers for the video game Fortnite. That gives you this kind of scale of what's going on with games across, just the industry. We're seeing this cross collaboration. Major, music performers are giving concerts inside of video games. And so it's become this big behemoth of a industry. Why is that important to us? Well, really, when we think about video games and English, that equals jobs, So in the same way that we might teach, students about, the music industry or the tourism industry, English for business purposes, thinking more about, English for video game purposes. There's all sorts of job opportunities around video games now we have to think about, from game development studios like Ubisoft or Electronic Arts or Sony, all the way to, things like shoutcasters at Overwatch, announcers, team coaches for esports competitions. And so, the more we think about those for our students and kind of, incorporate this spirit of gaming into our classroom, we can, tune students into that. And I understand I'm speaking to a group of teachers in South Korea where, video games have a strong cultural presence to begin with. But, what more can we do to just normalize games in ways that we haven't before? And, one of my favorite areas of this is, video game localization. When we're taking a video game and going, Genshin Impact in China versus the United States versus Korea, what changes have to be made? And so there's all these language opportunities even within the video game industry. Bondarenko talks about translation, editing, integration, regional adaptation. There's all these different kind of mechanics that need to be accomplished to make video games happen. And there's so much of it that's, opportunities for language. So, again, how can we incorporate some of these in? I don't have answers to that. And it's kind of one of those requests of what are people out there doing? And how can we get our students prepared for these jobs, these careers? But that's all to say, now we see kind of the scale and the size of video games. Well, how do we think about them? So we're going to bring them into our classroom. What is it that we should be doing to prepare our students to use them as an engagement tool, a learning tool, an active learning exercise? And, one of the ways I really like to think about video games is, they're a third space. During the pandemic, I met with my nieces and nephews in Animal Crossing when we couldn't see each other, physically. There's this idea that Stein, Kuhn, and Williams talk about in 2006, where they say, we have work and we have home. Well, we have this third place. Where do you go to socialize? Where do you go to be seen and to see your friends? Well, for a lot of people, that's a video game. It could be a massively multiplayer online game, or it could be something like Animal Crossing. So thinking about video games, not just as, do they teach my student language, but are they a space where my students can socialize? So really kind of a big stepping stone for thinking about video games in the classroom is, what kind of socialization and language use opportunities do they present? And how can I leverage that in my classroom? The other aspect of it, I think, is really cool. And I think it just, again, the opening talk, the opening keynote there on this conference, thinking about learning as a participatory culture, the spirit of this conference, this playful spirit that we've already seen, really reflects this notion of participatory culture. And it's something that's, part and parcel of video games. Is, what Jenkins in 2006, says, look, this game culture. The community around games have low barriers to engagement. There's strong support for creation. There's this informal mentorship where I share what I know and you share what you know. And then there's this social connection that happens. So, again, how can we think about using games, again, not just maybe as a software that teaches my student language, but as a space where my students can engage in this participatory culture. And another aspect of this that is a bit of a challenge is, as media scholars talk about, our educational system was really created in the industrial age where the teacher had the book and they had the information, and the information was scarce. Then we go through the industrial age and the information age where, knowledge starts to become a little cheaper, a little more widespread. And now media scholars are arguing we're in the experience age where, I create a film, share it with people at a conference, they may remix it and re-edit it and share it back with me. So how can we give students an opportunity to engage in experience sharing, experience creation, and then this participatory culture as well? So, games could be that great platform for that. If we think about them, a little bit differently than we would think about a book or a movie or music in our class. And, I think this really kind of can be summed up as, games can be a platform for experiential learning. This is something Kolb talks about in 1984. It says,
All good, everyone. Hold on while we check our systems here. Heidi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I
There's
noticed in the
the
chat
problem
someone,
is not with our account.
yeah, I think Jeff had an issue. This actually happened to us on Wednesday night with Michael Free. 5 minutes to the end of his presentation, he
I heard about
bricked.
that.
So the good thing to remember in the virtual world, nobody dies. We just have a short intermission while we figure out what's going on. We'll connect with Jeff and see if he can rejoin the meeting. Thanks for your patience.
am I back?
Oh, yeah, we've got you. Perfect.
Yay,
Okay,
small
Welcome
blip.
back.
No worries.
I'm not sure what happened.
No worries. Thank you so much.
Tuning in from across the planet has caused a little trouble. Okay, let me try this one more time. So yeah, if we think about this, this notion of giving students an opportunity to have a choice and see what happens when they make choices, it can be really powerful. I think about the movie Titanic. What if every time I watch the movie Titanic, I can make a different choice? And so you get to the end of the movie and, hey, gonna let Jack die, or hey, I'm gonna save Jack this time. And giving students that opportunity to make those choices starts to give them something to communicate. This is something that video game creator Will Wright mentions. He says, when we all win, we tend to win the same way, but when we fail, we all fail differently. And that's what we like to talk about. We like to share our differences and how we fail. And so how we give students those opportunities to try things and see the consequences of it. And so, thinking about that, of using them as like a space almost versus just kind of a text that may teach our student. What do we have to do differently? How's our class have to change? There's a challenge to using games in a certain way, in the sense that there's the TPAC model, it's called, by Mishra and Kohler, and they talk about how when we bring technology into our classroom, our pedagogy and our content also have to change. And typically when video games meet resistance, when they don't quite work in the classroom, it's often because we don't really think about how we're going to change our pedagogy. The way I teach is going to have to shift in response to this technology. So what do we need to do differently? And kind of thinking about that and really taking a look at, what's the bulk of our class time? Of course, some of these things we can change and some of these things we can't. But, there's the old, the learning pyramid that suggests, I remember about 5% of a lecture, but if I teach someone, I remember about 90% of that information. So how can we kind of drive the type of activities we do in our class further down that pyramid and get students doing more discussion, practicing, or teaching of others? And that's really where we can kind of see the advantages of using games. But if our class is mostly lecture, we're not going to see as much benefit from using games as we might. And this is something that Jensen talks about in 2005. It says, an adult, let's say, an adult learner can take about 15 to 18 minutes of direct instruction. So, if our class is 50 minutes of direct instruction, maybe there's time in there that we can start to really rethink and remap our classroom. And this is something that language teachers have always been really good at. We've done like present, practice, produce, or we've done think, pair, shares, where we have a little bit of a lecture and then an activity, a little bit of a lecture and activity. So, thinking about where we can make room for games in our classroom takes that little bit of planning. And it also, really we want to think about with Bloom's taxonomy, really pushing farther up the pyramid and thinking about when I want my students creating something or evaluating or analyzing something, that's where we can, use games. But if we just need to prepare for standardized tests, well, obviously that's just understanding or remembering. We probably don't want to think about implementing games for that. And so where do they fit in your day-to-day or unit by unit material is really what we're going for here. And really kind of thinking about, this notion of backward design. And so for this, if you're not familiar with backward design, we typically start by selecting the text. Okay, here's the book I'm going to use. Here's the unit I'm going to cover. Here's the activity I'm going to do. And then I'm going to create the assessment. And really what, backward design, we think about that as what are the course goals? A question I always like to ask teachers when I'm working with them is, 3 to 5 years from now, what is it that you hope students remember about your course? That's kind of your course goal. And from there, think about, well, how do you assess they've accomplished that? Well, what must students be able to think or do to be successful? So what are those learning outcomes? And then finally, what do they need to do in class? The lecture, the assignment, the activity, in order to meet the learning outcomes, to achieve the final assessment, to reach your class goal. And this has often been the biggest challenge with implementing video games in the classroom is we'll often pick the game. So, okay, this game is really popular with my students. I'm going to use it in class, but for what purpose? For what end? So really, kind of starting with, picking the game almost, very at the very last, as just that activity you're going to do in class, but making sure it, matches our course goals and our learning outcomes is critically important, and thinking about when your students engage with a game, they've got those, very kind of smart learning objectives, where it's a very specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely learning objectives. So we know exactly why they're doing what they're doing. Otherwise, games just seem like goofing off, like we're just having fun. And I think this is where, we really need more examples amongst educators and more opportunities to share the information that we have about using games in our class, so other teachers can see these examples and kind of, benefit from them, because this takes a lot of planning and preparation. And so, I say all that to really kind of summarize that making space for games is a balance. I like this quote from Ken Bain in 2004. It's a balance between the systematic and the messy. So the gameplay itself, throwing our students into a space and having them, make choices and see the consequences, it's going to be messy. But if the structure around it is very systematic and thought out and planned, we can see some really strong results. So it's up to us to be systematic, and it's up for the gameplay to be messy for our students to engage. So, well, how do we use them? So what are we going to do in class to use games? And and really kind of get the most out of them. So, you may just throw students in, right? The absolute messy. My kids love Among Us, and hey, we can do WH questions or simple and past progressive, modals of possibility. So there's that, just throw the students in. But that can often really kind of just, again, we're talking a lot about language use, but is it productive? Are students meeting your course goals? And so how do we start to provide a little bit of structure around the game and building things out? Now, there's a lot of great games out there that are educationally focused. One of my favorites is Quandary. This is a cool little science fiction game where you're the leader of a sci-fi colony, and you start to sort the colonists' facts from opinions and solutions, and you have to work to reach an agreement. Behind the scenes, this really is just a debate structure. Creating an argument, debating, and coming to a resolution. And so, we can use these kind of games with, things like graphic organizers. So, we can have students really kind of, hey, we're going to write down all the facts you see, write down all the opinions you see, sort them out, understand the difference, explain those differences, and then let's see what everybody decided. And we can do, a class debate. Okay, this group thinks A, this group thinks B, what happens? And, how can we give students, lots of different things. For example, with, The Sims would be another great example where we have students play The Sims and use a word map. Okay, here's all the furniture vocabulary. Here's all the food vocabulary they encounter. So giving students something as simple as a graphic organizer can be a great way to provide that little bit of structure so students are focused on, what it is that they're going to be using outside of the video games for a class, for a test, for an assessment. And again, that really kind of comes down to, having those clear, strong, carefully thought out, learning objectives. My students will be able to construct an argument and then defend that argument in a class debate. And it gives them that clear goal. Oh, here's why I'm going to do this. And this is one that I really like. James York, who's a language educator in Japan and is one of the co-runners of the Ludic Language Pedagogy Journal, which I highly recommend checking out. He's got a great structure for using games in the class. I think it's really cool. So he usually does this board games, but you could use it for a video game as well, where he has students read the rule book. So they're going to read through it, and it's a reading exercise first. And then he has them go to YouTube and has them watch a let's play or how to play video of that game. So now it's a listening activity. And then they take all the important vocabulary and they write it down. So they've got the English word, they've got the Japanese translation in this case, because he's a teacher in Japan. And so they go through these worksheets. And so it's a highly structured before activity. And then he has them play the game. So they'll go through and they'll play the game in class. But what he does is he'll record the students playing it. So he has an audio transcription of the students engaged in gameplay. And then afterwards, the students listen to the audio transcription and then they transcribe it. And so now they're going to go through and listen to all the language utterances that they made. And then they're going to do a grammar correction exercise afterwards. And so again, he's got this, basically the video game, the board game in James' case, is a way just to get the students talking, but he's got lots of different language structure happening around it. I think that's a really kind of great approach, again, where we throw the students into a space, but they know what they're doing beforehand, they know what they're doing afterwards. Other examples, something that, Sid Meier's, who created the video game Civilization, talks about. Video games is a series of interesting choices, right? And so, something like the Oregon Trail, if you've never played the Oregon Trail, you basically just travel across the Western United States and you have to make choices. Okay, I'm going to do this today, I'm going to do this tomorrow. How far can I go before I run out of food? And there's all sorts of variants of the Oregon Trail that you can play, but students can create a little diary activity. So, giving students that choice, every time they make a choice in a video game, they write it down, and catalog all those choices. And then something that a colleague of mine did in our language program here at Ohio University was have the students play Oregon Trail And then they read real diary transcripts from people who traveled the Oregon Trail. And so they were able to kind of interact together and then read about how their story was the same or different than people who actually traveled the trail. Another example here is we kind of rip through a variety of examples here is, even a classic classroom activity like a raft activity. If you've never done a raft activity, it's, you give students a role, an audience, a format, and a topic, and then have them go off and do that thing. And great like city building games like SimCity or City Skylines can be great at this, where students all have to come together and make choices together about how best to, grow the city in this case. This can be an example where, in a raft activity, they become a city council member and they have to, argue for a particular law or policy that's implemented on their simulation, their city building simulation, in a speech format to advocate for their recycling program. So how can we use kind of simulation-based games as a chance to give students an opportunity to take on a role and do a little bit of role-playing interactivity there? So these are just one example of giving students just that little more space to kind of make creative choices inside of a shared context. And of course, there's lots of different writing activities. We can think about video games as like a genre. Game reviews are a genre. They're a style of writing. So even if we don't have the opportunity to play video games in the classroom, can we have students bring them into the classroom? So, if a student wants to, write a video game review as a writing homework assignment, can they do that? One of my favorite examples, I had a kid who loved League of Legends in my class. So I made his audio journal. Each week he had to teach me a little bit about League of Legends. And so at the end of the semester, I played against him based on how well he taught me through his audio journals. Just that little bit of space, making the space to give students to bring this interest into the classroom can be another way we do this. One other example, this is something that I did way back in, wow, it's been almost 10 years ago now, is I had my students, we read in class in my introductory to creative writing class, we read the book World War Z, and we watched some zombie apocalypse kind of movies, mostly because it was right around that time in America that the apocalypse was wildly popular for whatever reason. But then I simulated the zombie apocalypse inside of Minecraft, and then my students wrote stories. So they got this experience in World War Z, and then they experienced it inside the video game, and they made comparisons between their actions and the actions of the characters in the books and what happened. And so this idea of, if I can't provide my students an experience within the four walls of my classroom, can I use video games to push an experience out to them that, may not be possible? So that's just kind of one way we can do things and try different, ways of being and trying to, role play different scenarios. So, how can we kind of think more about that? And again, these are just a few examples that I kind of, ran through very quickly, but maybe get you brainstorming a little bit and trying out different things. And then, sharing your ideas with us here in the chat or out on Discord or, in the KOTESOL journal as well. And, one of the things that's happening in this conference today is gamification. I'm hearing a lot about gamification already. And so I wanted to kind of wrap up by talking a little bit about that and what, as educators, we tend to do well and what we tend to not do so well with in terms of gamification. So really kind of what is it? We think about, gamification, we often think mostly about, points and badges and leaderboards, this idea that there's this competition. And, games are great. And, at their core, games are all about competition. But, as Alfie Kohn talked about in 1995, when someone is already intrinsically interested in a task, giving them a reward can often be more damaging. So, instead of just thinking about points, badges, and leaderboards, what is it about gamification that really speaks to our students and that we can use to create a more, positive classroom environment? And this is something that Yu-Kai Chow talks about in his book, Actionable Gamification. He kind of highlights these 8 criteria for gamification. And when we think about points and badges and leaderboards, we often really focus on the bottom, the scarcity, unpredictability, and avoidance. And that's something that Chow talks about. That's really the the negative aspects of gamification, the scarcity and the punishment. And unfortunately, that those can be, I don't want to say stressors, but they can be unpleasant. When I'm always competing for something and it's a scarce item, that may not be the way everybody likes to play. Some people just like to explore. Some people like to socialize. There's different ways of being a gamer. And so when we think about gamification, looking at what's already being done here at the conference, you can already see the way everybody here is thinking about gamification is up here, meaning accomplishment and empowerment. If we go back to Jenkins' participatory culture, same thing, right? So I think about, using game mechanics in the class or more gamified approaches to things in our classroom, thinking beyond scarcity and competition and thinking about how do we give students a sense of meaning, how do we empower them, how do we make them feel a sense of accomplishment. These are the really kind of parts of gamification that sit strongly with people. And so, really when we think about that, we want to think about it in a few different ways. And this is something that Prishtoma and Thorne talk about in 2009. You see, really designing what happens when people fail is as important as thinking about when they win. So with gamification, one of the big challenges in education that is really important is if students fail, can they try again? That classic, I take the multiple choice test and I don't do so well, can I take it again until I get the higher score? And always is that playful spirit. The conference here already is just let's play, let's have fun, let's explore, let's find things, is a really powerful motivator. And so how do we get that playful spirit when we think about gamification? Then finally, agency, the ability to make choices is really important. And so thinking about, can we give students more time to spend on activities they enjoy and less time on things they don't? That's not quite the easiest thing to do in a structured classroom, but really is a much more powerful component of gamification than just giving out points, right? Or giving out a, XP leaderboard. And so, to kind of wrap this up and head into the questions, I really like is this quote here by Deterding, who talks about this and says, look, games are not fun because they're games. They're fun because they're well designed. And so how do we make sure the classroom around the game is just as well designed? This is something I've noticed in, dabbling in both, game development world and educator world. We often have very similar conversations, but with just very different vocabulary. And so kind of the goal with promoting games literacy amongst educators is to help kind of bridge that gap, because a well-designed class is very much like a well-designed game, and our students are going to love it. Not because it's fun, but because it gives them a sense of purpose, gets them engaged, gets them motivated, and really kind of gives them that participatory culture component to it. So, how do we do that? How do we capture that spirit? It's something that we're all working on, and the more we share with one another, the better we'll get at it. And so, thinking about that, I've got some references there real quick. I do like the How to Do Things with Video Games is a great book. And then Steinkuhler and Williams' Third Places article is a great one to read to kind of think about, bringing games in as a social space for our classroom and for our students. And so with those in mind, I just wanted to say thanks real quick. And I want to get to the questions or, get a little conversation going. I see some chat going there in the chat box. And so I'm going to pop out of the presentation here and jump into the chat.
Great, thanks, Jeff. That was great.
Questions, comments, arguments? I already see David wrote about Mihail Csikszentmihalyi, who talks about the flow state. Yeah, making sure our students aren't too stressed, but it's not too easy either, right? That's what games do really well.
Excuse me, though, what I wanted to say about this is, when you said games aren't fun because they're games and because they're competition, I think what people are seeing, they're looking at people who do play games, and they say, oh, these people are really interested, and it's because they're getting points or they're getting things. And I think they're missing the point that the reason that games are so good, as well as other sports and other things, is this idea of flow. That is, and athletes say in the zone. When you're in the zone, it doesn't matter if you get points or not. As a matter of fact, they've had research that says if you are told that you're going to be penalized for doing this, people, if they're in the flow, they do it. So it's
Right.
the point is not the things that people are trying to say, not the things that they say, oh, this game has a lot of graphics, so graphics makes it really good, or this game has lots of hard rock music, that's it. No, it's this whole idea, if you get them in the flow, they're okay. Thank you.
Right. And, that's one of those important parts too, thinking about as a teacher is, giving students that, hey, you've got 5 more minutes, you've got 2 more minutes, you've got 1 more minute, because when we just stop them, we yank them out of that flow state, they're not listening anymore, right? So how do you ease them out of that flow state to move on to the next activity? Yeah. Oh, I see. I'm gonna post the this is the TESOL blog. So this is the International TESOL. I do a monthly TESOL blog, and you can check that out. And if you want to submit, hey, you want to take over for a month and do a guest column, give me a yell. I'm up for it. So we can scroll through questions. Anything in there? Thoughts?
Hey, Jeff. Hi. I have a question for you. So I teach middle and high school students. And actually, I had given one of my students who loves video games, I gave him some homework to watch some video, like YouTube videos about people playing the game. And I recommended that when he plays, he should play all in English to get some practice in. Unfortunately, I saw some negative backlash from that from both parents and administration. They didn't quite see that there could be some value in that. And so I was wondering, what would you recommend to a teacher like me in that situation? What can I say to try to convince both parents, administrators, those kinds of people?
Yeah, it's really difficult, and I think one of the biggest challenges is you often have to show after the fact. Once a student has been allowed to kind of discuss these things, you show the amount of new content that they've produced. This is what the student wrote before, but when I asked them to start writing about games, this is what they've produced. It's the big challenge of we can show the literature. There's research that says well, Steinkühler wrote another article, talked about students at a 7th grade level reading at a 4th grade level, but when they played the game World of Warcraft, their reading jumped up to 11th grade level, 10th, 11th grade, because it was context. Students understood that context, and so they understood the words a lot better. But that can be a hard sell, right? It's so what can we do just in showing student work. I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on too, because it's such a difficult thing to get that in from the parents. Yeah, I know that's not a great answer, but I hope it's a start.
No, thank you. I do think having something very concrete to show the actual learning goals that students have met would probably be the most effective way of trying to convince them. So I think that's a really good point. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's a case there is when we just show, hey, the students played this game, but when we can tie it back to the learning objectives, right? For sure, it's super critical. And I see a question in the chat from Namiko about games to promote empathy. Tons, there's Stardew Valley or Animal Crossing are a couple of great ones. But right off the bat, if you go to the website Games for Change, that's a great one where you can actually, I'll type that in, Games for Change. It's a website that lists lots of different games for age levels and types of educational content, and not just educational games, but games from all over, or even for entertainment purposes. And you can look for games that are empathy type of games. Some of those, like Animal Crossing, are very kind of friendly, and others, like This War of Mine, is a brutal game about surviving as a citizen impacted by war. But empathy is one of the keys to survival in that game and succeeding. And so, depending on the intensity of the experience you want your students to have, there's lots of games out there. Kristen says, are games usually played in groups or as a whole class? For me, in my experience, I found having them in groups tends to work better. Having everyone in a big whole kind of class environment tends to be a little too hectic. You have too many voices. When I use like a city building game and my students have to, guide the city into its growth, I typically do, 3 to 4 students, maybe 5 at the most. Otherwise, there's just too many opinions and it turns into real government and nothing gets done. So, how do we keep it small and a little more focused?
We had a question from Annika a little while back, sorry, asking what kind of games you use in the classroom at the moment.
What's that?
What games are you using in the classroom?
Honestly, these days, none. I can't believe I'm admitting that. But actually, something I've done lately that I've been really happy with is switching over to actual game engines. So there's a lot of great game engines from like professional, Unity or Unreal Engine to smaller ones like Twine, which is a little text-based one, and having students create their own games. A colleague of mine at Carnegie Mellon, Sebastian Drubel, had a great little experiment that I was replicating where he had engineering students coding a game for French students. And they found that the coders writing the game code were picking up French vocabulary on par with first-year students of French because they were just building the game. And so something, like filming a movie or having your students make little films, GameStar Mechanic, Code.org, Twine, Scratch, and then professional grade software, Unity Engine or Unreal Engine, you can have students make games. So that's what I've been doing a lot lately, is having my students build their own games. I like James's comment there. During playing a game, you win, lose, but making a game, it's rules and you always win, right? And even if it doesn't quite work out, you play it. And I think the component of making the game, you make it, have other students play it, give you feedback, fix it, feedback, that cycle starts to create a lot of real interesting language input. And then something I did at the very end of a previous semester was when the students were done making their game, they had to create an advertisement to promote their game. So not only we have the best game, but then we have the best hype for the game. So you can just that little incentive, a little more fun with it. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? I'm just curious about your academic route and what drew you to it, how you found a niche for yourself. You were able to finish your PhD in something that is more cutting edge. And I imagine that, in the traditional academic world, sometimes there's backlash to things that are not as accepted. So can you tell us more about that process? And if someone wants to go along that road, what would you say for advice? Thanks.
Yeah, this is where my bias comes in. I was that kid in the back of the room in school who never did very well, but always loved games. And so, I learned more from games, I felt sometimes, than I did from a book in the classroom. So there's a little bit of that childhood bias that came into things. But I actually was a foreign language teacher and a second language teacher. I was in Japan for a few years. I was in Mongolia for a few years. And I came back for my MA in TESOL and really saw like games as almost an adaptable textbook, a textbook that changed with my students. And that really got me thinking about how to use games in the classroom. And then started reading up on the work of James Paul G, and Constance Steinkuhler, folks like that. And I thought, well, I really love games. I really love learning. How can I mash them together? And so my PhD was a study on using World of Warcraft for problem solving. So, for people who want to get into it, you are going to bump into a lot of bias, and just making sure that you have the data. The two biggest questions I always get asked are, do video games cause violence? Unequivocally, no. The data does not support that at all. And then, are video games addictive? Unequivocally, no. The data says that people who play too many video games are hiding from another issue. It's, it's behavioral avoidance issues. And just being prepared with the data on those conversations, because they're just, again, that bias. But we've seen this before. Before it was comic books, they're going to rot your brain. Then it was Elvis, and it was television. Video games are just the latest educational boogeyman that people are afraid of. But in reality, it's just a normalization, right? And we're going to see that more and more. It's just kind of be prepared for those conversations and patient. A long answer to a short question. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, Jeff, we just had one more question in the chat there from James. He was asking if you've had much interaction with international communities and how does that compare with your research or students in the US?
It's interesting because one thing I've noticed is with, doesn't matter, the students around the world, they all react the same way positively to the idea of using games. And, I've seen the same response out of teachers. They're enthusiastic to try them, but they're not sure where to begin. And even the same, I've seen the same thing from administrators. They're often the bottleneck, the resistance, and that's something that I think is really important is, thinking about whether you're, the challenge I've seen in the United States or in Bolivia or in, Japan, same kind of challenges are often just administratively, there's no kind of plan to accept how to use video games in the classroom. We're still working that through. So, one thing I've seen a lot is, starting in clubs. A lot of teachers will say, I started using games in my English club after school. And then once my administrators saw the potential of them, they started letting me use them in the classroom on a more, kind of systematic basis. So, where to apply them and how is usually the common thread I see no matter where I work with educators.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Jeff. We're running out of time at the moment. So if you do have any more questions, maybe we can take it to the Discord channel afterwards and we can keep the conversation going there if anybody else would like to discuss anything further. And could we take a moment to everybody turn on their mics and just give a big round of applause for Jeff, because that was a really wonderful session. I think everybody really enjoyed it. So thank you so much for joining us, Jeff. That was brilliant.
Right. I'm looking forward to seeing everyone else's presentations. See everybody soon.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much once again. Thanks, Jeff. It was great. I will stop the recording here as well. Thank you, everybody.